afternoon and welcome everyone to KEI's webinar today entitled COVID-19 in North Korea, Surmountable or Existential Crisis. This past month, and especially these past 2 weeks, have given us a lot to talk about on North Korea. So we have a lot of ground to cover today in our conversation with our three distinguished speakers. For the sake of maximizing our discussion, I'm now just going to briefly introduce our three speakers in the order in which they'll be talking and on the topics which they'll be covering. For more on their backgrounds, I would direct you to the email that you received with the link for today's event. Starting us off will be Keith Luse, the Executive Director of the National Committee on North Korea, NCNK, a DC-based NGO dedicated to fostering mutual understanding between the peoples of the United States and North Korea. And he'll start us off by talking about more on the humanitarian side of the issues. We'll then move to my colleague and friend, Troy Stangarone, Senior Director and Fellow at KEI, who will walk us through some of the economic dynamics with North Korea right now in COVID-19. And then we'll move on to Jung H, the SK Foundation Chair in Korea Studies, at Brookings, who will conclude our interview style portion of the program by talking about the security and leadership issues in North Korea. And after that, we'll then turn to questions from the audience using the Zoom Q&A function, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. Please send in your questions throughout the discussion, throughout the first half of the webinar, so that by the time we finished with our interview style portion of the event, we can move right into the Q&A as soon as the time comes. So we'll turn things now over to Keith, and I'll ask you our first question. North Korea continues to say it has no cases of COVID-19, but obviously we should be skeptical about the claim. What do we know about the current spread of the virus in North Korea?
Kyle, thank you for having me today. Yes, North Korea continues to insist that there are no cases. At least that's the official line. There are a variety of press reports which suggest otherwise. Perhaps North Korea does have few cases. You know, early on, the border was closed, anti-epidemic campaign was begun, quarantine protocols put into place. But, you know, we're thinking here in terms of hard and fast time when in fact this disease is virus. It's not like running a sprint, is it, with a finish line that's definitely set. COVID-19 is going to be, North Korea is going to be dealing with COVID-19 for quite some time, as is the United States, as is the world. Now, the North Koreans insist that they're testing. WHO has announced that North Korea is testing the number of tests. My answer to that is basically, so what? I think there are a lot of questions that have to be asked related to the testing in North Korea. What about the training of the operators? What about the calibration of the testing equipment? What about the reliability of the items in the reagent kits? In the testing kits, the reagents, the specialized components, which are designed to detect COVID-19. What about the pool of individuals who have been tested? Are these individuals who were in quarantine prior to being tested? Questions that we cannot answer, and WHO really is not in a position to verify these answers or other information. So I'm skeptical, I must say. I should also add, though, that while the early border closure, quarantine measures probably saved lives, there are clearly some impacts on the humanitarian front, and I can get more to that later, Kyle.
Sorry about that, Zoom 101. Thank you for bringing up the humanitarian aspects of what's going on in North Korea, Keith, and something that North Korea has been doing. They've been primarily reaching out to the international community, looking for support in handling COVID. And how has the international community responded to these requests for humanitarian aid? And what types of supplies would be most critical for North Korea right now?
Well, Kyle, I should first say that North Korea has been unwilling to accept humanitarian assistance from US NGOs related to COVID-19. At the same time, North Korea is in regular contact with the UN, with China, with Russia, with a number of other countries. And so while North Korea is reaching out, I think it's a mixed bag, because they say they want assistance, and yet in Pyongyang, negotiations continue between UN officials and the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. There is presently a 30-day quarantine, which is enforced for people going into Pyongyang, which I think there are probably very few people going in at this time. The United Nations is attempting to work out protocols with North Korean officials that would shorten that quarantine time, that would allow for international NGOs to come in, to travel throughout the country. This is a challenge. And the longer that the North Koreans hold back on allowing international workers in, the longer the North Koreans hold back on allowing UN workers to rotate, this is going to contribute to the problem long-term in North Korea, because the NGOs are not able to get out and monitor. The NGOs are unable to get out into the country and to work on programs that really need to be addressed. There are thousands of tuberculosis, multi-drug resistance TB patients in North Korea. They will not be receiving their medication, malaria patients. And so we have not only the issue of containing disease, those diseases, treatments that are already underway, but this also gets into the question of prevention, the prevention of additional spread of MDR-TB, the TB, which have implications not only for North Korea, but for South Korea, for China, really for the region.
You mentioned TB and other diseases and how this is being impacted by COVID-19, but I'm wondering, what do we know about how COVID-19 is affecting the life of the average North Korean right now?
Actually, we don't know in terms of being fully informed. However, the government's response to COVID-19 in terms of preventing the entry into the country, or if it's in the country, working to prevent the spread, the government's response is having consequences that I don't believe are necessarily intended. For example, in Dandong and Dalian, there are an estimated 4,000 containers backed up, containers not getting into North Korea, which contain seed, fertilizer, medical supplies. Now, in fact, North Korea does produce a certain amount of seeds on its own and plants. But to answer your question, we are looking at potentially a looming disaster here due to interference with the planting season for crops, due to the inability of North Koreans to move around within the country. I think that there are likely consequences now, plus long term. And then, of course, Kyle, as you're aware, North Koreans, it's been reported, derive about 70% of their diet from the markets. Well, they're not going to be deriving their diet from the markets if there are not products in the markets for them to access. So again, this gets into supply chain issues. It gets into product availability. Reportedly, this week, there's a delegation from North Korea going to China, seeking more aid, seeking food assistance. This may be an indicator of things to come.
Just to go down that a little bit further, well, actually, just switch away from that to Moon Jae-in and the South Korea election. I know that's something else that happened in the recent weeks that is something that's worth tracking in how we think about dealing with North Korea. Obviously, Moon Jae-in, the Democratic Party, won a majority in the National Assembly elections in South Korea. Do you expect any shift in Moon's North Korea policy related to COVID-19 after the virus is contained, or because of the virus?
I would imagine that Moon Jae-in is, in his own mind, prepared to attempt and assist North Korea on COVID-19 if asked. This, of course, takes us into a larger picture in terms of the US-ROK alliance, which is already under some strain. How would South Korea provision of assistance to North Korea be seen by the US? I can't answer that question. Perhaps it would be viewed as an opportunity, or there might be concern. It would probably be according to the details. You know, what would be in the bottom line of all this? But yes, I think it is very likely that Moon Jae-in will attempt to provide assistance to the North. However, it might be up the north to whether to receive or not to receive it. As you're aware, earlier, several months ago, North Korea rejected the offer of 50,000 tons of rice from South Korea. So here again, Moon Jae-in may be very willing, but it's really difficult to say what the North Korean, how they would respond. And then again, what's the U.S. Commentary in all this?
Thank you, Keith. That was a really great overview of the humanitarian side of things. And I'm really looking forward to our further conversation once we move over to the Q&A. I'll move things over now to my colleague, Troy Stangarone, to talk more on the economic side of things. Troy, North Korea was one of the first countries to close its borders during the initial stages of the outbreak of COVID-19 in China. What has been the impact on North Korea's trade with China, both officially and through less official means, such as smuggling, if you can comment on that too?
Yeah, so thanks, Kyle. And thanks to both Keith and Jung for being here today as well. I think first, talking about this, I really want to sort of draw out that, how North Korea has handled this outbreak and how this outbreak is going to likely affect the economy is different from prior ones. During SARS, tourism at Pyongyang was still going on at that point, but it was shut down for 2 months. There were restrictions on foreigners entering into North Korea. During the Ebola outbreak, there was a 21-day quarantine for anyone returning to North Korea. And basically, foreigners were prohibited in taking part in the Pyongyang Marathon, which would have taken place during the Ebola outbreak in Africa. For cargo entering the country then, they were fumigating it. Now, there is some, Keith mentioned earlier on, there's about 4,000 cargo containers waiting to get in to North Korea. There has been some access and some trade going through, but it's been very sort of minimal. I'd like to bring up a slide that just kind of looks at what sort of North Korea's exports to China are right now. So if we can bring that up. So if you look at this, this is really just sort of going over the last year. And, it's been about 2 years that we've had sanctions in place on North Korea. And there's a rough sort of, this is the Chinese exports to North Korea. Fairly steady flow that North Korea settled into. You've seen a lot of consumer goods and agricultural products come in. But as you can see, once you get to this year, it drops off precipitously, even more so than under sanctions. And there's 2 notes I think we should make here. One is that China this year reclassified its trade data. Right now, you're in a situation to where January and February are now 1 reporting period rather than 2 in the past. They said they did this to try and align with other data they report in 2-month increments at the beginning of the year. This is largely also partially because you have the seasonal issue of the Lunar New Year, which this year was the end of January. But the one thing to note here is that despite sort of the declines that we're seeing, what you're also seeing is that, remember, it looks as though in that January, February period that there was a decent amount. I think looking at the March data, which falls down to very minimal amounts, that you really need to view this as what we're likely seeing is they shut the border at the end of January, and that the February numbers are likely the same, and that most of this trade took place in the month of January. And so what we're really seeing, the March data, for example, North Korea only exported $616 million worth of goods to China. I would say that the February numbers probably look like that or are worse in terms of North Korean exports. So in essence, what before had been much more significant is now basically fallen down to very small amounts. In terms of smuggling, the United Nations reported that last year through August, if I remember correctly, North Korea had smuggled about $370 million worth of coal. That works out to a little bit around $46 million a month. Satellite imagery has shown that many of those ships have now gone into dock. A colleague of mine had shown me a satellite photo that suggests that perhaps it's restarted, but it seems as though smuggling, while perhaps still going on, has probably fallen to minimal levels. And then there's reporting through Daily NK that along the border, for people smuggling across the border, that in essence, people have been told not to do it. There's been suggestions that North Koreans might actually shoot people who tried to cross the border. So while I assume that there's still smuggling going on, I'd say it's at much lower levels than prior to the shutting of the border.
Thanks for that, Troy. I think the graph is really telling of how things have fallen off the level there. Is there anything else? Any other external areas, external earnings that the crisis has affected that you can talk about?
Yeah. So one specific that had been growing in the last couple of years was tourism. There's only estimates on how much tourism is worth, but clearly with the border shut and nobody entering, that's dropped off. On the low end, it's probably averaging about $8.75 million a month. It's probably a little bit less than that in actuality because of winter and you'd have fewer tourists most likely. So you'd have that loss of income. And one of the differences on the tourism side is that, especially because North Korea sort of manages the number of tourists who come in, is this is income they probably won't be able to make up. Things like smuggled coal or other goods, you could potentially make up once the border reopens and we could see a spike in trade. But I also have a graph here that I'd like to bring up with Bitcoin and also the S&P 500. And this is where if we were in the office, I would ask people to raise their hand and see if how they felt about their stock portfolio right now. And the reason I raise this is that, one of the things that we hear people talk about is, well, maybe North Korea, because they can't earn money, will try and engage in more cyber attacks, try to steal more cryptocurrency. And they may be doing that. And I have seen reporting that there is one phishing attempt in South Korea that ties into emails about COVID-19. So there's no doubt they're doing this, but there are limits to what they can do. And the reason I say this is that I'm sure many people probably aren't happy with their stock portfolio right now, given the understandable decline in economic activity and the corresponding decline in the stock market. But actually, if the North Koreans had a stock portfolio, they'd probably be better off right now than they would be with Bitcoin, because as you can see, there's the steep decline when the WHO declares a pandemic of COVID-19. We've seen some recovery in Bitcoin as well, but ultimately Bitcoin is very volatile, and as the situation develops, while even stocks are volatile, it's likely that hacking has only a certain utility for the North Koreans. And at the end of the day, while it might help them maintain some revenue, it ultimately doesn't help them facilitate the imports of the goods that they need to keep, parts running. So on the goods side, North Korea had in recent years been taking and importing watch parts and fibers for wigs to make so they could re-export to China. And this doesn't help them really facilitate that. So while it might help on the income side a tad, it's also very volatile.
I'm sure those are both really good, useful graphs that you showed us about the external side of things. I'm hoping to shift now a little bit more towards the internal dynamics in North Korea. How might COVID-19 be impacting the domestic economy? Do we see any sort of fiscal stimulus like we've been seeing around the world?
Yeah, so I think this is the real challenge. North Korea is at a disadvantage to most countries in the world in that, one, the state banking system essentially isn't known to be involved in the market side of the economy. So you can't really necessarily pump money into the economy that way. We've seen reporting that North Korea is looking to issue bonds to try and pull in some of the hard currency that the Donju have. But interestingly, if you were going to stimulate the North Korean economy, it might actually have to come from the Donju side, and it's unclear that they would be willing to loan to businesses who might be struggling right now in North Korea when they don't know if they're going to ever be able to get that capital back. So you don't have the type of government mechanism you have in the United States and Europe and China to try and take and keep businesses afloat. You also don't have, the IMF is doing a lot of lending facilities for countries because North Korea isn't a member, and because the United States, for example, would block loans in the IMF. North Korea doesn't have access to international finance. They might as well. So I think it's really hard to see, how the North Koreans would be able to take and stimulate the domestic economy to try and keep things going in a manner that we've seen, in much of the rest of the world.
So this falls into my next question right here. How likely are we should we expect there to be a V-shaped recovery in North Korea? By that I mean, after a sharp fall in the economic well-being of the country, should we expect an equally sharp recovery?
I think this is hard to say. Some of this will depend on China. How quickly does China recover? Some of this will also depend on how quickly other countries recover. If you're going to export low-end watches, wigs, and things, there still has to be a market for that. And we're seeing even in China, while factories are coming back online, domestic consumption still seems to be down. People are more reluctant to spend, understandably. So you're going to have a drag on North Korea's largest market for exports. And any of those goods that are then re-exported to third countries, you're going to have that same kind of drag taking in place as you're going to see drops in domestic demand. So I think right now there's talk in the United States that we might experience more of a U-shaped recovery to where it takes time for people to get back into the workforce. A lot of people are laid off or will have difficulties. People will restrain spending. So I think there's the possibility for North Korea when the border reopens, if their customers in China are eager for purchases, that they could have a V-shaped recovery. But I think a lot of this will depend on that external environment. And I'd say right now, I would expect something more U-shaped perhaps than V-shaped.
You mentioned reopening. Is there any indication on what steps North Korea is taking to reopen the economy?
There's been reporting that North Korea would like to reopen trade to China, that they are taking some steps. In terms of individuals who will go to China to conduct trades, the story is that they would be allowed to go, or this is reporting, for 1 week. When they return, they would have to go into a month's quarantine. And I think this is another reason that it'll impact the prospects for a quick recovery, because if your traders are going to have to go into quarantine for a month once they return, it's going to be difficult to keep a lot of transactions up.
Thanks for all those great points, Troy. We'll now turn things over to Jung H, who will talk a little bit more on security and leadership side of things. I see a few questions already in the queue related to the big story of the week, Kim Jong-un's health. And he may be fine, though he might not be. We're really not sure. There's no way for the public really to know what's going on right now with any high degree of certainty. But for argument's sake, if his health were to mean the beginning of a new succession process in North Korea, what issues should the main concerns be for the United States and South Korea, Jung?
Hi, Kyle. Thanks for the question, and thanks to Troy and Keith. I always learn so much from them, and it's great to see all of you on the screen, if at least just virtually. When we're talking about succession, that's all the rage right now because of Kim's absence for the past 17, 18 days. But I think we can talk all day and all night and in through the weekend to speculate on what might have happened to him. But the responsible thing to do for policy makers, for governments, is to talk about what are the implications of his absence. And that has to do with what you're referring to is if there's a new succession process, what issues should be our main concern? And that is, are we ready? Are any of us ready for a succession process? And I think when I look at the landscape of East Asia right now and the regional dynamics right now, things are not great. The U.S. is, the death toll and the infections in the U.S. continue to mount. There is incredible amount of partisanship in the United States. It's the country's divided, and it's also fearful. Ties between U.S. and China are not great either, as they trade barbs about who started and who did a worse job on the pandemic issue. South Korea has done great, and it's being held up as the model of what governments should do. But there's still simmering tensions between South Korea and Japan over the history issues and the trade and security disputes that had begun to intensify last year. Not to mention the fact that the U.S.-South Korea relationship is not great either. The president reportedly scuttled a deal on the burden sharing agreement, and so even as he was asking the South Koreans for testing kits and other medical supplies. So given all of that, the perception of U.S. leadership, the perception of an absence of U.S. leadership and that our alliances and our relationships seem to be in disarray, that leaves us less ready for a succession crisis or scenario. This is a long-term strategic thing that we should always be thinking about, whether or not Kim shows up tomorrow or 2 weeks from now. And so we need to tend to our own houses and to our own relationships before you even look over at what's happening in North Korea.
Wise words. We're setting aside Kim Jong-un's health for the moment. With the U.S. dealing with COVID-19, North Korea essentially on lockdown, and the elections in the U.S. coming up in November, what type of progress with Pyongyang might be possible before the elections?
So when I look at the landscape, it looks, everyone's pretty much focused inward, trying to take care of their domestic issues in terms of, making sure that people are healthy, making sure that they're managing this pandemic, and trying to figure out what to do on the economic recovery side and trying to plan ahead for the future. And while things don't look great, I think, in terms of any kind of diplomatic progress, North Korea is also looking inward. And I don't anticipate big moves on North Korea on the diplomatic side. Kim Jong-un himself has been pretty clear that the door is shut pretty much on talks, but that he hasn't actually locked the door on that. So we can keep pushing, but he's waiting for President Trump to make the first move. And judging from what Secretary of State Pompeo said about where the policy is going to be the same, regardless of who's in power, I don't see the U.S. changing its position at all. So I think North Korea is going to muddle through, and I think we're going to muddle through. And so we have this status that is ambiguous, it's stalemated, and not very much going on.
While we're still on this topic of Trump and North Korea, talking with you earlier, you had a great article in Politico that came out this week on how Kim Jong-un's health scare highlights some of the weaknesses of the White House approach to North Korea. Can you walk us through a little bit of that argument?
Yeah, I think what President Trump did in trying to establish this leader-to-leader relationship with Trump, I think was worth trying. But the implementation, the way he went about it with unilaterally deciding that he was going to do so without the advice and the counsel of his national security advisors, as well as with our allies and partners, that there is this false hope placed on this leader-to-leader channel. And in effect, what happened was that as a result of investing so much in this top leadership channel, that it left very little incentive for Kim to branch out. And the president, I think, in many ways failed to take advantage of this relationship to condition a better personal relationship with Kim and conditioning that to progress on working level discussions. I think, in effect, what I think has happened is that U.S. negotiators and the working level officials, they're cut off at the knees from the beginning. And it was hard for them to gain traction as a result of the president turning a blind eye to the various weapons tests, the ballistic missile launches, saying that they're very standard. He dismissed the human rights violations, saying that Kim doesn't know anything about it, when the U.S. in 2017 has designated Kim Jong-un and his sister for human rights violations. And so with the president himself turning a blind eye toward all of these various things that the U.S. has criticized North Korea for, what is the point what is the point of Kim investing in anything, in any type of working level negotiations, when he knows what those working level officials are going to say? They're going to say, let's define denuclearization, let's define a roadmap, give us, let's talk about a list of declared materials. And I think that really left this big gaping hole and this was a very empty calorie relationship where there was a lot of sugar high in the beginning, but then we're really left with very little substance.
Those are some really great points. And I'd just like to direct the conversation back to the inner workings of North Korea. We know that in South Korea, COVID-19 has resulted in the postponement of military exercises and the need to quarantine American and ROK troops. Do we have any sort of indication as to how COVID-19 has been impacting North Korean military?
Yeah, and I think Keith and Troy mentioned this, how difficult it is to gain any kind of insight into what's going on at the ground level. And so we'll rely on what we see, the bits of information and the anecdotes and the reports that are coming out of North Korea through grassroots channels. Daily NK is one, Asia Press, Rimjingang is a good source as well, where you'll see reports of 100 North Korean soldiers at such and such border, near the border with China, falling ill from symptoms or dying from symptoms related to COVID, or 200 soldiers there. But it's also really hard to say whether that's COVID related or some other disease or the flu or something else. And so that's just a basic difficulty of getting insight into North Korea. But let's moving aside from the North Korean soldiers on the ground. I think COVID does not preclude more strategic provocations, right? And this is why, and Kim has been investing in the strategic weapons because he knows about the deficiencies of on the conventional weapon side. And so while we might say that we might anticipate some time of domestic or inward-looking North Korea, Kim wants to and needs to show strength. So I would not rule out more ballistic missile tests. We saw 4 rounds of them back in March, right when the region was really burdened by the height of the COVID pandemic.
I mentioned your article in Politico. You also have a new article out in Foreign Affairs based on your new book, Becoming Kim Jong-un, a former CIA officer's insights into North Korea's enigmatic young dictator, which just came out a few days ago. I'd like to recommend the book to both our audience. What can you tell us about the motivations of Kim Jong-un and in general, and perhaps how he's handling this current crisis?
What Kim has in his pocket is that he has this inherited infrastructure of repression. So locking people down, closing the borders, and all of those things are tools that he's had and that the regime has had to try to stem this infection. And quarantining, the propaganda apparatus is there for public education and for public announcements. The fear of punishment also works really well in getting people to do what they're supposed to do and what the government wants you to do. So you're not going to see, this is not Florida where people are wandering out into the beaches and having a picnic. But you have North Koreans basically, or trying at least to, or being very used to listening to what the regime has said. Although the smuggling and the trading and all these issues are, Troy and Keith have mentioned, are obviously things that people might need to do to try to get food on the table. But why does Kim and why does the regime have this repressive infrastructure? They rely on fear. They rely on fear of the outside, and it also feeds, or it's indicative of Kim's own paranoia. So right now, everybody's speculating about where he is. That's not just for us to speculate on, but it's also for people inside North Korea to speculate on. That it's only a very small group of people who would know where he is at any given point, and that's by design, and that's to make sure that you have overlapping. You have fear that you don't want everybody to know where you are, and that to try to make sure that he's not a target. So he's paranoid of what's inside his regime and also what's outside of the regime. So I think fear and paranoia also drives many of his actions. But he also needs to show strength, and that's where that cognitive dissonance is, where he seems to relish the bluster, relish the aggressiveness, but that I think is also his default. His default is aggressiveness, and I think that's where the danger is, that this spirals into some sort of miscalculation.
Those are all great points. And again, we tend to think about Kim Jong-un as being externally driven in a number of ways, but it's really important to us to remember the internal factors that really drive his regime, his legitimacy at home. And I want to thank you, Jung and Keith and Troy, for the great great answers to my questions, and we have a lot of questions as expected from the audience, so we'll head straight into those right now. The first one I think is really for you, Keith. This one comes from Liz Kim from BOA. She references something that Secretary Pompeo had said yesterday. Quote, "There is a real risk that there will be famine, a food shortage inside of North Korea." He said this on an interview with Fox and Friends. What did you think about this statement, if you had heard it before? And is there any indication that North Korea will experience this possible food shortage?
Well, first, in terms of the background, as relates to the Secretary's statement, I would need to refer her to the State Department for that information. I would say that given the COVID-19 impact in North Korea, given the consequences of the border closure, of the quarantines, et cetera, there's a lot of speculation about what this will mean down the road. Some are pondering, does this mean a redo of the famine? A book that I found as a helpful reference is what Andrew Natsios wrote in 2001, The Great North Korean Famine, which was an in-depth work about the famine at that time. And it's fascinating to go through that and try to sort out, as relates to indicators of the famine in the 90s, to what degree would similar indicators today suggest that North Korea is headed that direction. Personally, I think it is too early to predict that North Korea will in fact experience a famine. Typically with a crisis situation, we often tend to go to the worst case scenario that could happen with North Korea. On the other hand, it's entirely possible that if Kim Jong-un is able to physically survive COVID-19, if he is able to remain in control, he may very well use this virus situation as a means of consolidating his power further, as a means of incorporating more reforms, some of which have been stalled due to hardliners around him. So I'm sorry, that's a long answer to your famine question, but I would need to refer the reporter back to the State Department.
Thanks for that, Keith. A related question to Jung. Someone asks if the U.S. someone's referring to the U.S. potentially blocking South Korea offering aid to North Korea. And if the U.S. were to do something along these lines, were to prevent any sort of humanitarian aid, what impact could that have on the South Korea alliance, specifically issues regarding the troops and burden sharing?
That's not my understanding of what the U.S. is doing. U.S. has opened up the gates for humanitarian aid, and by the way, and that's not sanctioned anyway. So I think that's more of a red herring. I think there's good talking and collaboration between the U.S. and South Korea, at least on that part. There's at least that point is that on that issue there's convergence. But I think we have to know that as Keith and Troy mentioned, it's not the U.S. and South Korea, it's North Korea that is preventing or stymieing efforts to deliver aid. They've have had a cold shoulder on South Korea, the government's attempts to deliver aid. They pretty much ignored the U.S. They said thanks, but unless you change your views on everything else, then we're no thanks. And this seems like a long time ago, but the North Korean or Kim Jong-un said to South Korea pretty much get well soon. We know you're suffering from COVID, and so I want to keep the focus on the fact that it's not the U.S. and South Korea refusing to deliver humanitarian aid or bickering about humanitarian aid, but it's that North Koreans have pretty much been very lukewarm on these offers.
Thank you for that. The next question is directed really towards Troy. There are many signs of economic strain in North Korea right now that sort of signal a long-term impact on the North Korean economy. Where might North Korea turn for help under these circumstances? Reuters this morning issued a report that the Chinese Ministry of Commerce strongly denied knowledge of a North Korean delegation visit to possibly suggest that China may not be as helpful as we're thinking in terms of helping North Korea out on the economic or closely political side of this issue. So Troy, where can North Korea turn for hard currency? Where can it turn for economic help in this? And are they left alone, isolated more or less politically?
So thanks. First, I want to clarify one thing. I think earlier I may have said that North Korean exports were 616 million. We're so used to saying million and billion when you talk about trade. It was actually 616,000, so a little more than $500,000 last month in March. So just want to clarify that in case I did misspeak. But in terms of where they can turn to, I mean, China, is an obvious answer that potentially look to. The Chinese have in the past backstopped North Korea. There's been suggestions that they might provide food aid, but as Jung just pointed out, that if you can't get things in through the border, it's difficult to do that. So you have to resolve sort of that issue, and I think this is one reason why the North Koreans want to try to reopen things with China. But Russia is potentially another opportunity. But I think the real challenge that they have here is that you have two different crises going on right now. One is external and related to the economic impact of COVID in China and other countries. And, on the one hand, the type of aid that North Korea needs is minuscule, relatively speaking, compared to what China, can potentially manage. But China also has significant issues to deal with. Not only do they have, the attempts to reboot their economy to get factories back up, but then they have the follow-on impact of what the declines in Europe and the United States mean in terms of demand for their products. So you have this sort of double-edged side. But the other thing, and going back to this question of how much we actually know about what's going on internally, is how much has the domestic economy from potential restrictions been hindered there? We see, significant drops in transportation and consumption in restaurants and movie theaters and things, in China, in South Korea and other countries, during the COVID crisis. One would assume that to some extent some of that is going on. So you have this harder domestic hit as well. And so that makes it hard to, I mentioned that they were issuing bonds to try and get hard currency from the Donju. It's hard for the Donju to earn money right now, I guess. It's therefore hard for the regime to get money from them. So, domestically, there's fewer resources maybe to tap than there would be in normal times. You have these challenges outside. And so I'm not even sure that's really a question of political isolation, but it's just that there's a lot of challenges going on right now. And I think even for China, North Korea is probably lower down the list than it might be in the past, just because of the issues domestically, the issues economically. There's been reporting, I think today, that the United States might look to retaliate towards China over COVID-19. So you're dealing with things of that nature. So, really, I think it's a question of that just North Korea may not be as much of a priority for countries, not necessarily that they're politically isolated.
That sounds about right to me too, Troy. Next question is for Jung, asking about, are there any historical precedents for the Kim regime facing a potential perfect storm like this? We mentioned potential leadership transition, the COVID-19 outbreak, sharp and lengthy reduction in trade and smuggling, crop failures. There's really a lot of negative factors at play right now working against the Kim regime. Are there any precedents that could teach us a little bit more about how North Korea might react right now, and how did it cope then, and what they could sort of tell us about what we might expect from North Korea now?
Hi, thanks. Good question. Is there precedent for how North Korea dealt with this perfect storm of multiple crises? Maybe back in that famine where they first denied that anything was wrong and then blamed it on the weather, and then finally allowed some aid to come in. But this was after so many people had perished or suffered through all of this. So maybe we can see that sort of scenario. But I also think, then as now, it was like pulling teeth to try to get monitors in to make sure that people who really needed it the most did in fact get that aid. And there's some serious studies that suggested that up to 30% of the aid was siphoned off by various, corrupt officials or by the regime. And so that not every of the populations. And this also points to I say this over and over again, it's that the North Korean regime has a high tolerance for other people's pain. And so even though we have this perfect storm of potentially really devastating, devastating consequences, I think we can be pretty, relatively confident that it's not going to be the elite in Pyongyang or the core in Pyongyang that's going to be suffering the most, but it's going to be the people who absolutely need those trade networks and the access to the markets to be able to put just the basic food necessities on the table. So it's a tale of two North Koreas in that, you have this very elite group that has access to various luxuries and other items, but then you have at least 40% of the population that's malnourished and 8% of the population that lacks access to clean water. So you can imagine how devastating this perfect storm could be.
Yeah, it's really important that you hit on the bifurcation of the North Korean society. Thank you for including that. We have another question. This one is directed towards Keith. At a KEI forum last year, Steve Biegun, then envoy for North Korea, stated that given the prolonged stalling of U.S.-North Korea communications since the Hanoi summit, the U.S. welcomes any track 2.0 or 1.5 opportunities to participate in dialogue with North Korea. What types of these engagements do you see as helpful, whether humanitarian, scholarly, cultural, or other? And how do you see neutral third-party countries such as Mongolia playing in this mix for dialogue?
That's an excellent question. When we discuss Track 2 talks, perhaps we should clarify that Track 2 talks are the discussions between Americans in the private sector, non-governmental, and then North Koreans, who technically are probably with the government, but we still refer to them as Track 2 talks. Over the years, it's been my experience that Track 2 talks are very helpful in terms of obtaining greater insight about North Korea, its thinking. You get to learn more about their individual representatives. Having said that, as Americans, we really need to be smart how we go about this. On the American side, in recent years, you've had perhaps 8 to 10 people from the US who've engaged in Track 2 talks with North Korea. To their credit, these Americans now work to share information among themselves, not to coordinate their events, but to share information to make certain that they have the latest background on the North Koreans with whom they'll be meeting, et cetera. Typically, the Track 2 talks have been between Americans and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Now that's fine, except the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is only one part of the North Korean government. As efforts have been made in recent years for Track 2 talks between Americans, for example, between retired US military and retired North Korean military, the North Koreans have said no. As efforts have been made for Track 2 talks between Americans and representatives of the Workers' Party of North Korea, North Koreans have said no. You must deal with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Well, that's fine. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs is an important part of the life of North Korea. However, having said, at the end of the day, the party is very powerful. The military is very powerful. And so Track 2s are important. I believe that they are a very essential part of the overall process, but we have to be smart about how we put them together, with whom are we talking, and we have to make certain that we continue to engage with our own government in this process. And that, of course, brings up the benefit of a 1.5, where you might have a Track 2 setting, but perhaps there is a US government representative in the room. North Koreans would know that that was going to happen, and that has occurred in the past. And I believe this administration is open to that. Third country involvement, yes, very helpful. Mongolia has been an important venue for Track 2 talks, as has Malaysia, as have a number of other countries. And so there are some countries in the world that North Korea and the United States both respect and would be very satisfied to meet there in those countries serving as hosts.
Thanks, Keith. I think that often gets overlooked, and you rightly pointed out why those issues are so important. Two interrelated questions, I guess, for both Troy and Jung. First, what would be the idea of the South Koreans' public regarding cooperation with North Korea on COVID-19? If both countries agree to cooperate, how would it affect the relations between North and South? So a little bit more short to medium range, and looking a little bit further out, long term, in the case of change in North Korea, what are the prospects that Moon administration will be able to continue its push for unification? I don't know who wants to tackle that.
Do you want to go first, John?
I don't know. I missed that first part of your question. I froze out. Sorry, Kyle.
Oh, it's okay. So the first part of the question again, what would be the idea of the South Korean public regarding cooperation with North Korea on COVID-19? If both countries agree to cooperate, how would that affect relations between North and South Korea? And the other question was about unification, and how would a change in leadership impact Moon Jae-in's request for leadership, for unification with North Korea?
Thanks for that question. When we looked at discussions about what the voters back in April 15th during the National Assembly elections in South Korea, what they were voting on, they were voting on the government's response to COVID, and this was basically a thumbs up to the Moon administration for their good handling of the COVID crisis. North Korea didn't really appear there, and President Moon, despite all of his really grand efforts to try to get closer to North Korea, has had very little success in doing so. And in fact, there is a strong element of condescension and really just hostility coming from North Korea against the Moon administration. And so I don't see the South Korean public having a big appetite on helping the North Koreans. I think for humanitarian reasons and because it's the right thing to do, that we should do what we can to make sure that there's no catastrophic COVID pandemic spreading into North Korea, especially given their vulnerable populations. But again, this would be a great thing, but it's not for lack of trying by South Korea or by the United States or by the international community in trying to help North Korea. This has always been blocked. This has been blocked, or these efforts have been blocked by the regime. And that is indicative of how the regime treats the outside world, is that they don't want outside monitors looking in. They don't want to admit frailty or any sense of weakness or vulnerability. And yes, it would be a wonderful thing if the two Koreas can collaborate on something as really important as public health. But given the regime's motivations, its paranoia, its fears about the outside, about revealing too much of what's inside North Korea, that's always going to be a struggle to try to get the regime to accept and receive the aid that's being offered to them.
So I think only a couple of things I would add. One is that I think, if I remember correctly, the Moon administration has set aside about $5 million for humanitarian aid to deal with COVID in North Korea. I think if North Korea were to accept it, that would obviously be a positive, because while we don't know the details going on, it's hard to think that there's not an issue in North Korea, and we should try to help, if they're willing. In terms of how that would impact the relationship, either in the short to the medium term, I guess that's sort of a two-part question in that, are we talking about how that improves the feelings or, sense of belonging between North and South Koreans in general? And some of that might depend on how much aid would then get to the population and how much they know that it actually comes from South Korea, or how much are we talking about improving it really on a government to government level? I'd like to think that the North Korean government would see it as a sign of goodwill and perhaps, a reason to try and engage in some kind of, not talks on the nuclear issues, but, more cooperation between the two Koreas. But, it's unclear that's the case. But I do think we need to ask ourselves on the humanitarian aid side, is this really about building in terms of the relationship with North Korean people or with the North Korean government? Because I think those are probably separate issues here.
Great points all around. Thank you both for your answers. We have another question for Jung. Someone asks, if Joe Biden is elected president in November and returns to a more traditional U.S. diplomatic style, how will the North Koreans negotiate with him? Will they try to?
I worry about a different administration coming in because what the North Koreans might do. When in 2009, when President Obama came to power, that there was, President Obama expressed a willingness to talk and to have these conversations with North Korea and with Iran and Cuba and Burma and all of those countries that had previously had a confrontational approach with the confrontational relationship with the United States. But when Obama came to power in 2009, the North Koreans, the first thing they did was that they threatened to do a satellite launch, which they did. And then they followed up with a nuclear test, which they did. And that was driven in part by a variety of factors. One was the succession issue. This was after Kim Jong-un had his stroke, and succession was now in full swing. And those measures were designed in part to show strength domestically and internationally, but it was also a message to the incoming president that this is our neighborhood and this is how you're going to have to deal with us as a nuclear weapons power and not as this economically backward or isolated country. And so with a new administration, I think I would be very nervous about a return to provocative actions. To show that they're not going to be cowed by strategic patience or maximum pressure again, but to set the stage or set the table for their toughness and for their aggressiveness and to keep us on our back foot versus a more forward-leading initiatives.
So our last question comes to you again, Jung. I think it's fitting we ended the first half of the program talking about your book. And now we have another question that relates to your book here. Someone's asking, in your opinion, were there any major personality shifts in the case of Kim Jong-un since his childhood until now? And if yes, then how exactly might they have influenced his policy views in the regime?
I mean, I would not make big judgments about how somebody was like in their childhood and bring that up to how they're acting as a 36-year-old with nuclear weapons and dozens of nuclear weapons and lots of diverse and very reliable ballistic missiles. So I'd be careful to make too big a judgment. And this is, and Kim is not, as I tried to talk about in the book, is that Kim is not this flat person where what you see when he was 5 is exactly what you see when he's 36. And the title is Becoming Kim Jong-un. It's that, like all of us, Kim Jong-un's personality matters, but that all of these things and his behavior and his actions are in part not just driven by the inner self, but also driven by what he sees and what he interprets as the outside world. And so when I look at Kim being somebody who is surrounded by sycophants and surrounded by people who are trying to get ahead by getting closer to him, what he's created is an echo chamber where whatever he says goes, and the people around him trying to curry favor, try to mimic his behavior and mimic his aggressiveness. And so we have So I suspect that there's very few officials who are going to raise their hand and say, hey, should we try XYZ tactic or XYZ policy? And given the perception of Kim as aggressive and belligerent and very wanting to show toughness, we're going to see officials trying to mimic that versus trying to constrain. So what I worry about is that as he sees what's going on now and what he has seen in the past couple of years with the summit diplomacy, is that he's validated some key assumptions. One is that the U.S., despite all its talk about military action, will not do it because of South Korea, because of allies pulling the U.S. back, and that China, despite everything that the North Koreans have done to poke their thumb in Beijing's leader's eyes, that China's not going to abandon. And so you put that together and you have a very confident and perhaps overconfident leader in North Korea who thinks that, that his leash is longer than it actually might be.
Well, thank you, Jung. Thank you, Keith, Troy. You've all done a fantastic job, and I'm sure I speak for all of the listeners on the call right now, is that you've provided a great deal of information on issues that you don't necessarily think about on a regular basis, that aren't in the headlines, and then provided, just as importantly, provided a lot of clarity on some of the things that we've been reading about recently in the news. Before we end, I wanted to alert everyone to 3 upcoming events that KEI is doing that may be of interest. On May 5th, we have a conversation with David Maxwell on instability in North Korea, preparing for instability in North Korea. On May 12th, we have another conversation with former USFK Commander General Skip Sharp on the Special Measures Agreement, the burden sharing agreement between Seoul and Washington. Both of these will be at 2 p.m. on those days. And then on May 13th, we have a program with the authors of a recent OECD report on North Korea starting at 10 a.m. We hope to see everyone there for that as well. And again, thank you everyone for joining, and thank you for our speakers for a great talk today. Thank you.